When I slid the 30-day notice under Derek's apartment door last Friday morning, watching through the peephole as his face went from confusion to complete shock when he realized his ex-girlfriend had just become his landlord, I finally understood what true satisfaction felt like. After 2 years of being told I was quote, financially irresponsible and would never understand real estate like he did, I had just purchased the entire building he lived in, and he had exactly 1 month to start paying me rent or find somewhere else to live. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning it all came together started like any other Wednesday in downtown Portland, Oregon. I was sitting in my compact one-bedroom apartment on Morrison Street, the same apartment Derek had constantly criticized during our relationship as proof that I couldn't handle adult responsibilities. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to drive across town to his trendy Pearl District building to deliver news that would completely upend his carefully constructed world. I had been planning this moment for 14 months. 14 months of secret research, strategic financial planning, and watching Derek parade his real estate expertise around like a trophy, while treating my career ambitions like cute hobbies that would eventually fade away. 14 months of listening to him say things like, maybe you should focus on something more stable, and quote, real estate investment requires a certain kind of business mindset that not everyone has. Well, it turns out everyone can develop that mindset when they're motivated by the right combination of determination and spite. The drive to his building that morning felt surreal. I kept glancing at the manila folder on my passenger seat containing the deed that had arrived via certified mail just 2 days earlier. The deed that made me the official owner of the Meridian Apartments at 1247 Northwest Irving Street. The same address where Derek had lived for the past 18 months. The same building where he'd hosted countless dinner parties, bragging about his investment portfolio and his, quote, natural instinct for property values. The same living room where he'd laughed when I mentioned wanting to get into real estate investment. Emma, Derek had said during our last Christmas together, cutting into his expensive steak with that condescending smile he reserved for my unrealistic dreams. Property investment isn't like playing house. It takes real capital, market knowledge, and frankly, a level of financial discipline that not everyone possesses. His friends had nodded along while I sat there, quietly absorbing yet another lecture about my supposed limitations. You're creative and passionate, he'd continued, but maybe you should stick to what you're good at and leave the serious investing to people who understand these things. What he didn't know was that my job as a commercial loan officer at Pacific Northwest Bank had given me access to market data, property records, and investment opportunities that most people could only dream of seeing. What he couldn't see was that my irresponsible lifestyle had actually been a carefully orchestrated savings plan that allowed me to accumulate liquid capital while he was spending his inheritance on a flashy car and expensive gadgets. What he failed to understand was that I had been quietly studying real estate law, market analysis, and property management strategies every evening after work, building expertise that would soon prove invaluable in ways he never imagined. But sitting in my car that Wednesday morning, staring at his building with its modern glass facade and expensive landscaping, I realized he was about to learn exactly what my financial discipline and market knowledge were capable of accomplishing. The building looked exactly the same as always, imposing and trendy, the kind of place that attracted young professionals who wanted to live in Portland's most desirable neighborhood. The same building where Derek had moved after our breakup, claiming he needed space to focus on his investments, and room to grow without someone holding him back financially. It was in this building where Derek had started dating his new girlfriend, Jessica Chen, a marketing executive who apparently shared his views about smart money management and long-term financial planning. It was here where he'd posted Instagram photos of his sophisticated lifestyle, his networking events, and his growing collection of investment books. It was in the lobby of this very building where, just 8 months ago, I had run into him and Jessica, and he had delivered what he probably thought was the final blow to any lingering hopes I might have had about our relationship. I remember that encounter clearly. Derek was wearing an expensive wool coat and carrying what looked like architectural plans, probably for one of his renovation projects. Jessica was perfectly put together in the way that successful marketing executives always seem to be, with her designer handbag and confident posture. They were clearly coming back from some kind of business meeting or property viewing, looking every inch the power couple that Derek had always wanted us to be. "Emma," he'd said, his voice carrying that mixture of surprise and slight irritation that people use when encountering an ex in an awkward situation. "What are you doing here?" "Visiting a friend," I'd replied, which was technically true. My college roommate Sarah lived in the building and had invited me over for coffee. What I didn't mention was that I'd been using these visits to study the building's layout, observe the tenant demographics, and assess the property's investment potential. "Still living in that little place on Morrison?" Jessica had asked, her tone attempting friendliness but carrying an undertone of pity that made my skin crawl. Derek had clearly told her about my modest living situation. "For now," I'd answered, watching Derek's expression carefully. "I'm exploring some options for upgrading." Derek had actually laughed. "Emma's always been optimistic about her housing prospects," he'd told Jessica, as if I wasn't standing right there. "She has big dreams, but hasn't quite figured out the practical side of real estate yet." "Well, the Portland market is definitely challenging," Jessica had replied, clearly trying to be diplomatic. "It takes significant capital and market knowledge to make moves in this area." "Exactly," Derek had agreed, warming to his favorite topic. "Emma's got the enthusiasm, but real estate investment requires a completely different skill set. You need to understand market cycles, financing structures, and cash flow analysis. It's not something you can just jump into." Standing there in the lobby of what would eventually become my property, listening to Derek explain to his new girlfriend why I would never succeed in real estate, I had made a decision that would change everything. I was going to prove him wrong in the most dramatic and undeniable way possible. I was going to buy something he couldn't ignore, something that would force him to acknowledge my capabilities. I just had no idea how perfect an opportunity was about to present itself. Let me properly introduce myself and explain how I got to this point. I'm Emma Catherine Rodriguez, 29 years old, and until last Wednesday, I was just another underestimated ex-girlfriend living in the shadow of someone else's expectations in Portland, Oregon. By day, I work as a senior commercial loan officer at Pacific Northwest Bank, a position that most people find impressively boring but that I genuinely love. There's something deeply satisfying about analyzing loan applications, assessing property values, and understanding the complex mechanics of commercial real estate financing that most people never see. My office sits on the 15th floor of the U.S. Bancorp Tower downtown, with windows that overlook the Willamette River and give me a perfect view of Portland's evolving skyline. It's not glamorous work in the traditional sense. I spend most of my time reviewing financial statements, property appraisals, and market analyses, but it's taught me more about real estate investment than any expensive seminar or business school course ever could. When you process dozens of commercial loan applications every month, you start to see patterns. You learn which neighborhoods are experiencing growth, which property types are appreciating fastest, and most importantly, you understand exactly how much property investors can actually afford versus how much they think they can afford. That knowledge would prove to be more valuable than I ever imagined. I live in a 750-square-foot one-bedroom apartment in the Buckman neighborhood, about 15 minutes from downtown. It's not much by Portland standards. A galley kitchen, a living room barely large enough for a couch and coffee table, and a bedroom that fits a queen bed with about 2 feet of walking space on each side. But it's mine, and after years of careful budgeting, I've managed to pay off my student loans and build up what most people would consider an impressive emergency fund. My building is a converted warehouse from the 1920s, with exposed brick walls, original hardwood floors, and the kind of character that Derek always dismissed as trying too hard to be trendy. My neighbors are a mix of artists, graduate students, and young professionals who appreciate affordable rent in a walkable neighborhood more than luxury amenities. Mrs. Patterson, who lives directly below me, is a retired librarian who always saves me packages when I'm not home. James, who lives across the hall, is a chef at one of Portland's farm-to-table restaurants and occasionally shares leftovers when he's experimenting with new recipes. They've become something like a chosen family to me, especially after my relationship with Derek ended. They know about my professional goals and have never once made me feel small or unrealistic for wanting to build wealth through real estate investment. Emma's got a good head for numbers, Mrs. Patterson told James just last month while we were all checking our mail. Smart girls like her always find a way to make things work out. She was right, though I didn't fully realize it at the time. My current life might not look impressive from the outside, especially compared to Derek's trendy Pearl District lifestyle, but I've worked incredibly hard to get here. After graduating from Portland State University with a finance degree and a 3.7 GPA, I spent 8 months frantically searching for entry-level positions while working part-time at a credit union. The job at Pacific Northwest Bank wasn't my dream position initially, but it came with excellent benefits, clear advancement opportunities, and most importantly, access to commercial real estate data that would prove invaluable. Over the past 5 years, I've been promoted 3 times. I started as a junior loan processor making $42,000 annually. Got bumped up to loan officer at $52,000, and now as a senior commercial loan officer, I'm earning $71,000 per year. It's not tech industry money, but in a city like Portland where the median household income hovers around $58,000, it's enough to live comfortably while saving aggressively. And saving has been my obsession since Derek and I broke up. While my friends were spending weekends at expensive brunches or taking costly trips to wine country, I was clipping coupons, cooking meals at home, and putting 40% of every paycheck into a high-yield savings account. My entertainment budget consisted of library books, free hiking trails in the Columbia River Gorge, and the occasional matinee movie ticket. My wardrobe came from outlet stores and end-of-season sales. It wasn't particularly exciting, but it was purposeful. Every dollar I saved was a dollar toward my independence, toward proving that I could build something meaningful without anyone's approval or financial support. The irony is that my job at Pacific Northwest Bank put me in a unique position to understand exactly how the local commercial real estate market functioned. I processed loans for small business owners looking to buy their first commercial spaces, established investors expanding their portfolios, and developers planning major projects throughout the metro area. I saw which neighborhoods were attracting investment, which property types were in highest demand, and which areas were poised for significant appreciation. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I also learned about the more complex aspects of commercial real estate transactions. Things like lease structures, tenant rights, property management requirements, and cash flow analysis. Most people buying residential properties never think about these details, but as a commercial loan officer, I had to understand every aspect of property ownership to properly assess loan risk. That education would prove to be invaluable in ways I never anticipated. My relationship with Derek had lasted 2.5 years, and for most of that time, I had genuinely believed he was helping me become more financially responsible. He was 4 years older than me, worked as a project manager for a construction company, and had inherited about $80,000 from his grandfather, which he'd used to buy his first investment property, a small duplex in southeast Portland that he rented out to college students. Derek talked about real estate constantly. He read investment blogs, attended networking events, and had strong opinions about market trends and neighborhood development patterns. He seemed so knowledgeable and confident that I initially felt grateful to be learning from someone with actual experience. He would explain concepts like cash flow analysis and cap rates with the patience of someone teaching a child, and I absorbed everything he said because I wanted to understand his world. But gradually, I started to notice that his explanations didn't always align with what I was seeing at work. His market predictions were often wrong, his understanding of financing structures was surprisingly shallow, and his investment strategies seemed to rely more on gut feelings than actual data analysis. When I would mention something I'd learned from processing commercial loans, he would dismiss it as theoretical knowledge that didn't apply to real-world investing. The dynamic became increasingly frustrating as I gained more experience in my career and started developing my own understanding of real estate markets. Derek wanted a girlfriend who would admire his expertise and defer to his judgment, not someone who might actually know more about property financing than he did. Our conversations about real estate shifted from educational to patronizing, with Derek constantly reminding me that there was a difference between processing paperwork and actually building wealth through property investment. The final months of our relationship were marked by a series of increasingly condescending interactions that made me realize Derek didn't see me as a potential partner in building wealth. He saw me as someone who needed to be managed and directed, rather than someone who might have valuable insights to contribute. That realization would eventually fuel the strategy that led me to buy his apartment building, but first, I had to endure the painful process of watching our relationship deteriorate and listening to Derek explain why I would never be successful in real estate investment. The morning I'm about to deliver his eviction notice, I can barely contain my excitement about proving just how wrong he was about my capabilities. My personal life before Derek was a study in calculated independence and quiet ambition. I had grown up in Salem, Oregon, the youngest of 3 children in a middle-class family where financial stability was valued above flashy success. My father worked as a high school math teacher, my mother managed the office for a local veterinary clinic, and both of my older brothers had followed conventional paths. One became an accountant, the other a nurse. I was the one who had always been fascinated by numbers, but specifically by how money moved through different systems and created opportunities for those who understood the patterns. During college, while my roommates were majoring in communications or psychology with vague hopes of figuring it out later, I had been laser-focused on finance with a clear goal of working in commercial banking. I wasn't interested in personal banking or residential mortgages. I wanted to understand how businesses grew, how properties generated wealth, and how smart financial decisions could compound over time into significant assets. My professors noticed my focus, and several of them had recommended me for internships that led directly to my position at Pacific Northwest Bank. The job had been everything I hoped it would be and more. Commercial lending exposed me to business owners, property developers, and investors who were building wealth in ways that most people never saw. I processed loan applications for restaurant owners buying their first buildings, tech entrepreneurs expanding into larger office spaces, and real estate investors assembling portfolios worth millions of dollars. Each application was like a case study in how successful people thought about money, risk, and long-term planning. More importantly, I learned to read financial statements like detective stories. Every number told a piece of the narrative about how businesses operated, how properties generated income, and how successful investors structured their deals to minimize risk while maximizing returns. I could spot inflated revenue projections, identify cash flow problems before they became critical, and recognize investment opportunities that others might overlook because they were hidden in complex financial structures. This expertise made me incredibly valuable to Pacific Northwest Bank, but it also gave me insights into the Portland real estate market that even experienced investors rarely possessed. I knew which neighborhoods were about to see major development because I processed loans for the developers. I understood which property types were becoming more profitable because I saw the financial performance data from existing buildings. Most importantly, I knew which areas were being overlooked by mainstream investors because the loan applications revealed opportunities that weren't being pursued by bigger players. My colleagues at the bank had always respected my analytical abilities and work ethic. Jennifer Walsh, my supervisor, frequently assigned me the most complex commercial deals because she knew I would catch details that others might miss. Emma has an instinct for this work, she would tell other department heads during our monthly meetings. She understands the business side of real estate in a way that takes most people years to develop. But my personal relationships had always been more complicated than my professional success. I had dated sporadically through college and my early 20s, but nothing serious had developed until I met Derek at a happy hour event hosted by the Portland Young Professionals Association. He had seemed sophisticated and confident, with strong opinions about local development projects and an apparent understanding of investment strategies that I found attractive. Derek worked as a project manager for Morrison Construction, a mid-sized firm that specialized in residential developments throughout the metro area. He had been with the company for 6 years and had worked his way up from an entry-level position to overseeing projects worth several $1 million. His work gave him exposure to different neighborhoods, construction costs, and market trends, which made him an interesting conversationalist about real estate topics that I was passionate about. More importantly, Derek seemed to take my career seriously in a way that previous boyfriends hadn't. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, listened when I explained complex deals I was processing, and expressed genuine interest in learning about commercial real estate finance. For the first few months of our relationship, I felt like I had finally found someone who understood my professional ambitions and could be a true partner in building wealth over time. Derek lived in a renovated loft in the Alberta Arts District, a trendy neighborhood that was experiencing rapid gentrification and rising property values. His apartment was everything my place wasn't: spacious, modern, with exposed ductwork and polished concrete floors that looked like something from an architecture magazine. He had furnished it with expensive modern pieces and maintained it with the kind of attention to detail that suggested someone who took their living environment seriously. The loft was also where Derek would hold court about his investment philosophy and market predictions. He subscribed to several real estate publications, attended monthly meetings of the Portland Real Estate Investors Association, and had strong opinions about which neighborhoods were poised for growth. He could talk for hours about cap rates, cash flow analysis, and the importance of location in determining long-term property values. Initially, I was impressed by his knowledge and grateful for the education. Derek would explain concepts like gross rent multipliers and debt service coverage ratios with the confidence of someone who had been successful in real estate investment. He owned the duplex in Southeast Portland, which generated modest rental income, and was actively looking for his next acquisition. He seemed to be living proof that young professionals could build wealth through strategic property investment, and I wanted to learn everything he could teach me. But as our relationship developed and I gained more experience in my own career, I started to notice inconsistencies in Derek's expertise. His market predictions were often dramatically wrong. He had insisted that the Jade District would see major appreciation, but property values there had remained stagnant for 2 years. His understanding of financing structures was surprisingly shallow. When I mentioned seller financing or lease option agreements, he would dismiss them as exotic strategies that weren't worth pursuing. Most tellingly, his own investment performance was much less impressive than his confident explanations would suggest. The duplex he owned had been purchased with his inheritance money, not through careful saving or strategic planning. The rental income barely covered his mortgage payments, and he had never successfully completed a second acquisition, despite constantly talking about expanding his portfolio. When I would mention properties I had seen through my work that seemed like excellent investment opportunities, he would find reasons why they weren't suitable: too expensive, wrong neighborhood, not enough cash flow potential. Gradually, I realized that Derek's investment expertise was largely theoretical. He read about real estate investment and attended networking events, but he hadn't actually executed successful deals or built meaningful wealth through property ownership. His confidence came from studying the subject rather than mastering it through practice, and he was more interested in appearing knowledgeable than in actually learning from people who might know more than he did. This became particularly frustrating when I started sharing insights from my work at the bank. I would mention trends I was seeing in commercial lending, successful investment strategies that borrowers were using, or opportunities that seemed particularly promising based on the loan applications I was processing. Derek would listen politely, but then explain why my perspective was limited by working in banking rather than actually investing in properties. "It's different when it's your money on the line," he would say when I mentioned a particularly interesting deal structure I had seen. "Bank employees see the paperwork, but investors live with the consequences of their decisions. You can't really understand real estate until you've bought and managed properties yourself." The condescension was subtle but persistent. Derek positioned himself as the practical expert while treating my professional knowledge as academic theory that didn't apply to real-world investing. He was always careful to acknowledge my intelligence and expertise in banking, but he made it clear that real estate investment was a different arena where his experience gave him superior judgment. This dynamic became more pronounced when Derek started dating me. He would introduce me to his investor friends as the smart banker who keeps me honest about the numbers, which sounds complimentary but actually positioned me as a supportive advisor rather than someone who might have independent investment ambitions. His friends would ask about my work, but the conversations always circled back to Derek's projects and opinions about market trends. The breaking point in our relationship came during a dinner party Derek hosted for his investor group in February of last year. The gathering included about 8 people, mostly men in their 30s and 40s who owned various properties throughout Portland. They spent the evening discussing potential acquisitions, sharing war stories about difficult tenants, and debating which neighborhoods would see the most appreciation over the next 5 years. I had been looking forward to the evening because I genuinely enjoyed talking about real estate and thought I might learn something valuable from the group's collective experience. I had also recently processed several interesting commercial deals that I thought might generate useful insights for the discussion. But from the moment the evening began, it was clear that I was expected to listen rather than contribute. The group's conversation was dominated by Derek and two other investors, Marcus Webb and Ryan Thompson, who had both assembled larger portfolios than the others. They spoke with the confidence of people who had never been seriously challenged on their investment strategies, and their analysis of market trends was surprisingly unsophisticated given their apparent success. The key is getting in early on neighborhoods that are about to turn, Marcus was explaining while Derek nodded approvingly. You have to develop an instinct for spotting areas before the mainstream investors catch on. Exactly, Derek agreed. It's about understanding the fundamentals that drive appreciation: demographics, transportation infrastructure, development patterns. Most people just follow the crowd, but successful investors see opportunities before they become obvious. I had been processing loans for properties in several of the neighborhoods they were discussing, and I knew that their analysis was missing some crucial factors. The demographic data they were citing was outdated, they were overestimating the impact of certain transportation projects, and they weren't accounting for zoning changes that could significantly affect property values. When there was finally a lull in the conversation, I mentioned that I had been seeing some interesting trends in the commercial lending market that might be relevant to their residential investment strategies. The table went quiet, and Derek gave me a look that clearly suggested I should let the experts continue their discussion. That's interesting, Ryan said politely, but commercial lending is pretty different from residential investment. Different financing structures, different tenant relationships, different market dynamics. Actually, I replied, there's quite a bit of overlap, especially when you're looking at neighborhood development patterns and property value trends. The commercial deals often predict what's going to happen with residential values because businesses move into areas before residents do. Derek interrupted before I could explain further. Emma sees a lot of deals through her work, he told the group, but she doesn't have experience actually managing properties or dealing with the operational side of investment. It's a different perspective. The dismissal was gentle but definitive. The conversation moved on to other topics, and I spent the rest of the evening listening to investment strategies that I knew were flawed while being unable to contribute insights that might actually be helpful. That night, lying in Derek's expensive bed in his trendy loft, I realized that our relationship would never evolve into the kind of financial partnership I had hoped for. Derek didn't want an equal partner who might challenge his expertise or contribute independent knowledge. He wanted an admiring audience who would validate his investment strategies and defer to his judgment on real estate matters. The more I learned about commercial real estate through my work, the more our relationship dynamic became strained, because Derek's identity was built on being the real estate expert in our partnership. The final months of our relationship were marked by increasingly frequent disagreements about money, investment strategies, and long-term planning. Derek would make pronouncements about the local real estate market that contradicted what I was seeing through my work, but he would dismiss my perspective as too narrow or focused on the wrong metrics. When I mentioned that I was interested in making my own property investments, he would explain why I wasn't ready for such a complex undertaking. Real estate investment isn't just about having money, he told me during one particularly frustrating conversation. It requires market knowledge, operational experience, and the ability to make quick decisions under pressure. Maybe once you've been in banking longer and built up more capital, we could look at doing something together. The "we" in that sentence was telling. Derek couldn't imagine me succeeding as an independent investor. He could only envision a scenario where I might eventually be a junior partner in deals that he would lead and control. That conversation was when I started seriously planning my exit from the relationship and my strategy for proving him wrong about my investment capabilities. I just had no idea how perfectly the universe was about to align to give me the opportunity to become Derek's landlord and force him to acknowledge exactly how wrong he had been about my potential. The final conversation that ended our relationship happened on a gray March morning in Derek's loft. But the seeds of that confrontation had been planted weeks earlier, during what I now realize was a systematic pattern of financial manipulation disguised as helpful guidance. Derek had been subtly undermining my confidence in my own judgment, while positioning himself as the only person qualified to make investment decisions for both of us. It started with small comments about my spending habits. "Emma, do you really need another coffee this week?" he would ask when I stopped at my usual cafe on the way to work. "You could save probably $200 a month just by making coffee at home." This from someone who spent $60 on craft cocktails every Friday night and owned an espresso machine that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Then came the lectures about my living situation. "You're basically throwing money away on rent," Derek would say while we sat in my apartment, his tone suggesting he was doing me a favor by pointing out my poor financial choices. "At your age, you should be building equity instead of paying someone else's mortgage. Every month you stay here is a month you're not building wealth." The irony was devastating, considering that Derek himself was living in a rental property while claiming to be a real estate investor. When I pointed this out, he would explain that his situation was different because he was strategically renting in an appreciating neighborhood while saving capital for his next acquisition. My rental, apparently, was just wasteful because I wasn't simultaneously building an investment portfolio. The gaslighting became more sophisticated as Derek realized I wasn't immediately abandoning my own financial strategies in favor of his advice. He started questioning my professional judgment in subtle ways that made me doubt my own expertise. "Are you sure about those market trends you mentioned?" he would ask after I shared insights from my work. Sometimes bank employees get a skewed perspective because they only see the deals that make it through underwriting. Derek had a remarkable ability to make his ignorance sound like wisdom. When I mentioned that I was seeing increased demand for mixed-use properties in certain neighborhoods, he would respond with vague statements like, "Retail trends are really unpredictable right now," or "Mixed-use properties can be challenging for inexperienced investors." He never provided specific counter-arguments or data to support his dismissive responses, but he delivered them with such confidence that I started questioning whether my observations were as valuable as I had thought. The manipulation escalated when Derek began involving his investor friends in our conversations about money and real estate. During group dinners or social gatherings, he would steer conversations toward topics where his friends would inevitably agree with his perspective and implicitly validate his superior expertise. "Emma thinks the Hawthorne district is going to see major appreciation," he would announce to the group, his tone suggesting that my opinion was naive but amusing. "Hawthorne's been stagnant for months," Marcus would respond predictably. "The fundamentals just aren't there for significant growth." The group would nod along, and Derek would give me a sympathetic look that said, "See? This is why you need to listen to people with more experience." What they didn't know was that I had processed 3 separate loans for commercial properties in the Hawthorne district, including a major mixed-use development that would likely catalyze significant residential appreciation within 18 months. But pointing this out would have required revealing confidential client information, so I was forced to sit quietly while Derek's friends dismissed my analysis based on outdated information and surface-level market observations. The pattern was insidious and effective. Derek wasn't directly telling me I was stupid or incompetent. He was creating social situations where other people would implicitly validate his superior judgment while making me feel isolated and uncertain about my own expertise. Every gathering reinforced the narrative that Derek was the real estate expert, and I was the well-meaning amateur who needed guidance and protection from making expensive mistakes. But the strategy that finally opened my eyes to what Derek was really doing involved money more directly. In February, he started suggesting that we should combine our resources to make joint investments. "You've got great savings discipline," he would say, "but you're not generating any returns on that money sitting in a savings account. We could pool our capital and buy something that would actually build wealth for both of us." His proposal sounded reasonable on the surface. I had accumulated about $95,000 in savings. Derek claimed to have around $40,000 available for investment, and together we could potentially purchase a small rental property that would generate passive income while appreciating over time. Derek offered to handle all the research, property management, and decision-making because of his superior experience in real estate investment. The more we discussed this possibility, the more excited Derek became about the prospect of controlling a larger pool of capital. He started bringing me printouts of properties he thought we should consider, none of which met the investment criteria I had learned were important for successful real estate deals. They were either overpriced relative to rental income potential, located in neighborhoods with declining fundamentals, or structured as lease option arrangements that heavily favored the sellers. When I pointed out these concerns, Derek would dismiss them as overthinking. You're applying banking standards to investment opportunities, he would explain patiently. Sometimes you have to trust market instincts rather than just looking at numbers on paper. This is exactly the kind of analysis paralysis that keeps people from building wealth. But I knew that Derek's market instincts were actually just emotional responses to marketing materials that had been designed to make properties appear more attractive than they actually were. The numbers didn't work, the locations were questionable, and the deal structures were designed to benefit sellers rather than investors. Derek wasn't demonstrating superior market knowledge, he was demonstrating that he didn't understand basic investment analysis. That realization led me to investigate Derek's financial situation more carefully, and what I discovered was shocking. Derek didn't actually have $40,000 available for investment. His duplex was heavily leveraged and generated negative cash flow after accounting for maintenance, vacancy, and property management costs. His personal expenses were almost entirely funded by credit cards, and his checking account rarely contained more than a few $1,000s at any given time. Derek's entire financial persona was essentially fictional. He lived an expensive lifestyle by accumulating debt, talked about real estate investment to mask the fact that his only property was losing money, and projected confidence about market trends to disguise his fundamental lack of investment success. Most devastatingly, he was trying to access my savings to fund speculative investments that would allow him to maintain his lifestyle while putting my financial security at risk. The confrontation that ended our relationship happened when Derek presented me with paperwork for a joint investment he had secured without consulting me. He had apparently put down earnest money on a small commercial building in northeast Portland, using funds he didn't actually possess, and expected me to provide the down payment and closing costs for a deal I had never agreed to pursue. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity I've been talking about," Derek announced that March morning, spreading purchase agreements and financial projections across his kitchen table like a general planning a military campaign. "The seller is motivated, the neighborhood is about to turn, and we can get in at a price that will generate immediate cash flow." I looked at the documents and immediately recognized several red flags that Derek had either missed or chosen to ignore. The building was old and would require significant structural improvements that weren't accounted for in his financial projections. The neighborhood demographics didn't support the rental rates he was assuming. Most importantly, the purchase price was approximately 20% above comparable sales in the area, suggesting that the motivated seller was actually extracting premium value from inexperienced buyers. "Derek, this doesn't look like a good deal," I said, reviewing the numbers carefully. "The cash flow projections are based on inflated rental assumptions, and you haven't budgeted for the renovation costs that are going to be necessary to make this building competitive." Derek's response revealed everything I needed to know about his actual financial expertise and his respect for my judgment. "Emma, you're overthinking this again," he said, his tone shifting from enthusiastic to condescending. "This is exactly what I've been trying to explain to you about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical investment experience. Sometimes you have to trust the fundamentals and take calculated risks." "These aren't calculated risks," I replied, my voice remaining calm despite the anger building inside me. "These are fundamental miscalculations that are going to result in significant losses. The rental market in this area won't support these rates, and the renovation costs are going to eliminate any positive cash flow for at least 2 years. Derek stood up and began pacing around his kitchen, clearly frustrated that I wasn't immediately agreeing to fund his investment scheme. "This is the problem with dating someone in banking," he said, as if I wasn't standing right there. "You see every deal through a loan officer's perspective, instead of understanding what actually drives real estate profits. Banks are conservative because they're using other people's money. Investors need to be more aggressive to build real wealth." That statement revealed not only Derek's fundamental misunderstanding of how banking worked, but also his complete dismissal of my professional expertise and judgment. He wasn't interested in my analysis because he had already decided that my perspective was inferior to his instincts. He wanted access to my savings account, not my insights about real estate investment. "Derek, I'm not going to invest in this property," I said firmly. "The numbers don't work, the location doesn't support the assumptions you're making, and I don't think you've done adequate due diligence on this deal." His reaction was swift and revealing. "Fine," he said, gathering up the paperwork with angry, jerky movements. "I guess I'll have to find another investor who understands the value of this opportunity." Maybe someone with actual investment experience instead of just banking theory. Maybe you should, I replied, realizing that our relationship had just ended even though neither of us had explicitly said so. Derek continued ranting about my risk aversion and analysis paralysis, while I quietly gathered my things and prepared to leave his apartment for the last time. "You're going to regret this," he called after me as I headed toward the door. This is exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people stuck in little apartments instead of building real wealth. You'll never own property with that attitude. Those words, "you'll never own property with that attitude," followed me home and echoed in my mind for hours afterward. Derek had essentially declared that my careful analysis, professional expertise, and financial discipline were obstacles to success rather than assets that would help me build wealth. He had dismissed my judgment so completely that he couldn't imagine me succeeding in real estate investment without his guidance and approval. But sitting in my modest apartment that evening, reviewing my savings account balance and thinking about everything I had learned about commercial real estate through my work, I realized that Derek had just given me the greatest gift possible: absolute clarity about what I needed to prove and exactly who I needed to prove it to. Derek believed that real estate investment required aggressive risk-taking, emotional decision-making, and trust in market instincts over data analysis. He thought that my banking background made me too conservative and analytical to succeed as an investor. Most importantly, he was convinced that I would never be able to build wealth without his guidance and expertise. I was going to prove him wrong on every single point. That night, I started researching commercial property investments with a focus that bordered on obsession. I wasn't just going to buy real estate. I was going to buy the exact type of property that would force Derek to acknowledge my capabilities while demonstrating the value of careful analysis over emotional decision-making. I was going to show him what real market knowledge looked like when it was combined with adequate capital and disciplined execution. I just had no idea yet that the perfect opportunity would involve becoming Derek's landlord and controlling the place where he lived. That revelation was still several weeks away, but the foundation for my strategy was already being built through careful research and systematic planning that would soon prove more valuable than Derek's instincts had ever been. The opportunity that would change everything came disguised as a routine Wednesday morning at Pacific Northwest Bank, buried in a stack of loan applications that had been flagged for secondary review. I was working through foreclosure proceedings and distressed asset evaluations when I encountered a file that made my pulse quicken with possibility: a commercial property foreclosure in the Pearl District that included multiple residential units. The property was the Meridian Apartments at 1247 Northwest Irving Street, Derek's building. At first, I thought it was some kind of cosmic coincidence. The building where Derek lived, where he hosted his investor friends and projected his image of sophisticated urban living, was being foreclosed on by Columbia River Trust, the regional bank that held the commercial mortgage. The current owner, a limited liability company called Northwest Urban Holdings, had defaulted on payments 6 months earlier and was now facing forced liquidation of the asset. I should have immediately transferred the file to avoid any conflict of interest, but my professional curiosity got the better of me. The financial documents told a fascinating story about how poorly the building had been managed and how desperate the current ownership situation had become. Northwest Urban Holdings had purchased the property 3 years earlier with an ambitious renovation plan and aggressive rental projections that had never materialized into actual income. The building contained 12 units, 8 one-bedroom apartments, and 4 two-bedroom units, along with ground-floor commercial space that had been vacant for 18 months. The previous owners had invested heavily in cosmetic improvements like new fixtures and modern appliances, but they had ignored fundamental structural issues that were now creating serious maintenance problems. The HVAC system was failing, the roof needed complete replacement, and the electrical infrastructure was outdated and potentially dangerous. More importantly, the rental income was significantly below the projections that had supported the original financing. The previous owners had assumed they could charge premium rents for Pearl District living, but they had overestimated both the demand for their particular location and tenants' willingness to pay high prices for units with ongoing maintenance problems. Half the apartments were vacant. The occupied units were generating rents 20 to 30% below market rate, and the commercial space was contributing zero income to the property's cash flow. The foreclosure documents revealed that Columbia River Trust was eager to liquidate the asset quickly, rather than manage a problematic property with significant capital improvement needs. They were planning to auction the building with a reserve price of $1.2 million, which was approximately 40% below the assessed value and almost 60% below what Northwest Urban Holdings had paid 3 years earlier. As I studied the financial projections and market analysis, I realized that the previous owners had made almost every mistake that Derek had been advocating in his investment strategy. They had focused on cosmetic improvements rather than fundamental structural issues. They had based their rental assumptions on optimistic market projections rather than actual comparable properties. They had leveraged the purchase heavily without maintaining adequate reserves for capital improvements. Most importantly, they had assumed that location alone would overcome operational deficiencies. But from my perspective as a commercial loan officer who understood both property valuation and building operations, I could see that the Meridian Apartments represented an extraordinary opportunity for someone with adequate capital and realistic expectations. The building's bones were solid, the location was genuinely desirable, and the current problems were largely operational rather than structural. With proper management, realistic rental pricing, and systematic capital improvements, the property could generate substantial cash flow while appreciating significantly over time. The auction was scheduled for 6 weeks away, which gave me enough time to conduct thorough due diligence and arrange financing if I decided to pursue the opportunity. More intriguingly, Oregon law required foreclosure purchasers to honor existing lease agreements, which meant that Derek and all the other current tenants would automatically become my tenants if I successfully acquired the building. The poetic justice was almost too perfect to believe. Derek, who had spent months explaining why I would never succeed in real estate investment, was living in a building that I could potentially purchase and manage more successfully than its previous owners. The man who had dismissed my analytical approach to property evaluation was experiencing the consequences of exactly the kind of emotional investment decisions he had been advocating. That evening, I began the most intensive research project of my professional life. I needed to understand every aspect of the Meridian Apartments' financial performance, physical condition, and market potential before deciding whether to pursue the acquisition. More importantly, I needed to develop a comprehensive business plan that would demonstrate whether I could succeed where the previous owners had failed. I started by analyzing 5 years of comparable sales data for similar properties in the Pearl District. The neighborhood had experienced steady appreciation over the past decade, but rental rates had been more volatile depending on building quality and management effectiveness. Well-maintained properties with professional management were commanding premium rents, while buildings with operational problems were struggling to attract and retain tenants. The Meridian Apartments fell into the second category, but the underlying fundamentals suggested that proper management could move it into the first category relatively quickly. The building's location was excellent, walking distance to Powell's Books, the Pearl District streetcar line, and dozens of restaurants and cafes that attracted young professionals. The unit layouts were functional and had been updated with modern amenities that tenants valued. Most importantly, the building's problems were fixable with adequate capital and competent management. I spent hours reviewing construction costs, researching property management companies, and developing financial projections based on realistic rental assumptions and systematic capital improvement schedules. The numbers were compelling if I could purchase the building at or near the foreclosure reserve price. With proper renovations and professional management, the property could generate positive cash flow within 6 months while building equity through both operational improvements and natural market appreciation. The financing structure would be challenging but manageable. I had $95,000 in liquid savings that could serve as a down payment, and my income and credit profile would support a commercial mortgage for the remaining purchase price. Pacific Northwest Bank's commercial lending department would handle the financing, which meant I would need to recuse myself from the underwriting process, but my colleagues in the department had already indicated their willingness to expedite the application if I decided to proceed. More importantly, I had identified a property management company that specialized in Pearl District buildings and had a track record of successfully repositioning underperforming properties. Morrison Property Group had managed similar renovations and had developed systematic approaches to tenant retention, rent optimization, and capital improvement scheduling that aligned perfectly with my business plan for the Meridian Apartments. The due diligence process revealed additional opportunities that the previous owners had overlooked. The ground floor commercial space could be subdivided into 2 smaller units that would be more attractive to local businesses and generate higher rental income per square foot. The building's parking situation could be improved by reconfiguring the existing spaces and potentially adding additional spots in an underutilized area behind the building. Most importantly, the building's energy efficiency could be dramatically improved through systematic upgrades that would reduce operating costs while making the units more attractive to environmentally conscious tenants. By the end of my second week of research, I had developed a comprehensive business plan that addressed every aspect of the Meridian Apartments operations, from immediate capital improvements to long-term growth strategies. The financial projections showed that I could purchase the building, complete necessary renovations, and achieve positive cash flow within 8 months, while building substantial equity over time. But the emotional satisfaction of the opportunity was even more compelling than the financial potential. Derek had spent months explaining why my analytical approach to real estate investment was inferior to his intuitive market instincts. He had dismissed my banking expertise as irrelevant to actual property ownership and had predicted that I would never succeed without his guidance. Now I had the opportunity to demonstrate that careful analysis, adequate capital, and professional management could succeed where emotional decision-making and aggressive leverage had failed. The irony was perfect in ways that Derek would never fully appreciate. He was living in a building that had been ruined by exactly the kind of investment strategy he had been advocating: high leverage, optimistic projections, and focus on cosmetic improvements rather than fundamental operations. I was preparing to purchase that same building, using the analytical approach he had dismissed as overly conservative and theoretical. The third week of my research focused on the legal and operational aspects of property ownership, particularly the requirements for managing existing tenants during a foreclosure transition. Oregon tenant protection laws were complex, but they generally favored property owners who maintained properties professionally and treated tenants fairly. As long as I honored existing lease agreements and provided adequate notice of any changes to building operations, I would have significant flexibility in repositioning the property for improved performance. Most intriguing, Derek's lease agreement contained several clauses that would give me substantial leverage over his tenancy. His rent was below market rate for his specific unit, his lease was month-to-month rather than long-term, and he had violated several minor provisions related to unauthorized modifications and guest policies. While I wouldn't necessarily use these violations to create problems for Derek, they would give me options for managing our relationship if he became difficult about rent increases or building improvements. The fourth week involved developing detailed renovation timelines and contractor relationships that would allow me to improve the building's condition without disrupting existing tenants more than necessary. I had identified a general contractor who specialized in occupied building renovations and had experience working around tenant schedules and space limitations. The improvement plan could be implemented in phases that would minimize inconvenience while systematically addressing the building's most pressing maintenance needs. More importantly, I had developed a tenant communication strategy that would position the renovations as improvements rather than disruptions. Professional property management companies had taught me that tenant retention was significantly more cost-effective than tenant replacement, so maintaining positive relationships with existing residents would be crucial for the building's financial performance. The fifth week was devoted to finalizing my financing arrangements and preparing for the auction process. Pacific Northwest Bank's commercial lending team had pre-approved my loan application, and I had arranged for an inspector and appraiser to evaluate the property immediately after the auction if my bid was successful. I had also retained a real estate attorney who specialized in commercial acquisitions and could handle the closing process efficiently. Most importantly, I had developed a bidding strategy that would maximize my chances of success while avoiding the kind of emotional overpaying that had contributed to the previous owner's financial problems. Based on my analysis of comparable sales and renovation costs, I could justify bidding up to $1.4 million for the property, but I planned to start conservatively and increase my bid strategically based on the competition. The night before the auction, I reviewed my entire research file one final time. 6 weeks of intensive analysis had confirmed that the Meridian Apartments represented an excellent investment opportunity for someone with adequate capital and realistic expectations. The building could be successfully repositioned through professional management and systematic improvements, the location supported premium rental rates, and the purchase price would allow for substantial returns on investment. But beyond the financial calculations, I was motivated by the opportunity to prove that Derek had been completely wrong about my investment capabilities. He had predicted that I would never own property because I was too analytical and risk-averse. Tomorrow, I would have the chance to become his landlord using exactly the careful analysis and conservative financial management that he had dismissed as inferior to his market instincts. The satisfaction of that reversal would be worth every hour I had spent researching the opportunity. The morning of the foreclosure auction arrived with the kind of crisp November clarity that made Portland's skyline look like it had been painted in watercolors. I woke up at 5:15 a.m., 3 hours before my alarm, my mind already racing through final preparations and potential complications that could derail 6 weeks of careful planning. The auction was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the Multnomah County Courthouse, and I had laid out my clothes the night before, a charcoal gray suit that projected serious business intent without appearing overly aggressive. The auction would be conducted by Portland Premier Auctions, a firm that specialized in commercial real estate liquidations throughout the Pacific Northwest. I had attended 2 of their previous events to observe the bidding dynamics and familiarize myself with their procedures, which had proven invaluable for understanding how professional investors operated in competitive situations. Most bidders were either local developers looking for renovation projects or out-of-state investment groups seeking Portland market exposure at discounted prices. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:45 a.m. with a cashier's check for $150,000 as my earnest money deposit, along with copies of my pre-approval letter and financial documentation to prove my bidding qualification. The auction room was smaller than I had expected, with about 30 folding chairs arranged in front of a portable podium where the auctioneer would conduct the proceedings. Only 14 other people were present when I arrived, but I recognized several faces from previous auctions and local real estate investment meetings. The most concerning presence was Harold Brennan, a veteran developer who had been acquiring underperforming properties throughout Portland for the past 15 years. Brennan was known for aggressive bidding and deep pockets, which meant he could potentially drive the price beyond my maximum budget if he decided the Meridian Apartments fit his investment criteria. He was sitting in the front row with a thick folder of documents, clearly having done his own due diligence on the available properties. Another potential competitor was Sarah Kim, who represented a California investment syndicate that had been expanding into the Portland market over the past 2 years. Kim had a reputation for systematic analysis and patient capital, which meant she would likely have realistic maximum bids rather than emotional attachment to specific properties. However, her group typically focused on larger apartment complexes rather than smaller buildings like the Meridian Apartments. The auctioneer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the efficient demeanor of someone who had conducted hundreds of these sales, called the session to order at exactly 10 a.m. He explained the bidding procedures in the monotone voice of legal necessity, minimum bid increments, payment deadlines, inspection contingencies, and the legal obligations of successful bidders. Today's auction would include 7 properties, with the Meridian Apartments listed as the 4th item on the schedule. The first 3 properties were smaller commercial buildings in less desirable neighborhoods, selling for amounts ranging from $340,000 to $580,000, with minimal competitive bidding. Most participants seemed to be targeting specific properties rather than bidding opportunistically on everything available, which suggested that serious competitors had done their homework and identified their preferred acquisitions in advance. When the auctioneer finally announced 1247 Northwest Irving Street, Pearl District, minimum bid $1.2 million, my heart rate spiked so dramatically that I was certain everyone in the room could hear it pounding. This was the moment that 6 weeks of preparation would either pay off or prove inadequate against more experienced competition. "Do I have an opening bid of $1.2 million? The auctioneer asked, scanning the room for responses. Harold Brennan raised his hand immediately. Of course he did. The Pearl District location and renovation potential were exactly the kind of opportunity that attracted his development projects. $1.2 million to bidder 7, the auctioneer acknowledged. Do I have $1.25 million? I raised my hand, trying to project more confidence than I felt while my stomach churned with anxiety about the competitive dynamics that were about to unfold. $1.25 million to bidder 11. Do I have $1.3 million? Brennan countered without hesitation, clearly prepared to bid aggressively for the property. A third bidder I hadn't noticed earlier joined the competition at $1.35 million, suggesting that multiple investors saw value in the building's potential despite its current operational problems. The bidding continued in steady $50,000 increments: $1.4 million, $1.45 million, $1.5 million. By the time we reached $1.55 million, the third bidder had dropped out, leaving just me and Brennan locked in what felt like a financial duel with my future real estate career hanging in the balance. $1.55 million to bidder 7, the auctioneer announced after Brennan's latest bid. Do I have $1.6 million? This was approaching the upper limit of my predetermined budget. I had calculated that I could justify bidding up to $1.65 million based on the building's renovation potential and cash flow projections, but anything beyond that would strain my financial capacity and potentially compromise the investment's profitability. I raised my hand for $1.6 million, hoping that Brennan might have reached his own maximum threshold. $1.6 million to bidder 11. Do I have $1.65 million? Brennan looked at me for the first time during the auction, clearly trying to assess whether I was serious about continuing to bid or if I might withdraw at the next increment. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 seconds, he raised his hand for $1.65 million. This was my moment of truth. I could bid $1.7 million, which would exceed my careful financial planning, but might secure the property if Brennan had finally reached his limit. Or I could maintain my disciplined approach and accept that more experienced investors with deeper pockets would occasionally outbid me on attractive opportunities. The auctioneer was waiting for my response to Brennan's $1.65 million bid. Do I have $1.7 million? I thought about Derek's condescending lectures about the importance of market instincts over conservative analysis. I thought about his prediction that I would never own property because I was too risk-averse and analytical. I thought about the satisfaction of proving him wrong by becoming his landlord through exactly the kind of careful planning he had dismissed. I raised my hand for $1.7 million. $1.7 million to bidder 11. Do I have $1.75 million? Brennan stared at me again, clearly surprised that I was willing to bid beyond what he had probably assumed was my budget limit. He consulted his documents briefly, then shook his head and settled back in his chair. Going once at $1.7 million, the auctioneer announced. Going twice at $1.7 million. Sold to bidder 11 for $1.7 million. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through my entire body. I had done it. I now owned the Meridian Apartments, which meant I was officially Derek's landlord. The building where he had projected his image of sophisticated urban living was now my property, and he had no idea what was coming. The administrative procedures following the auction passed in a blur of paperwork, signatures, and financial transfers. I provided my earnest money deposit, completed the purchase agreement, and received a temporary ownership certificate that would be replaced by the official deed within 10 business days. The auctioneer explained my rights and responsibilities as the new owner, including the requirement to honor existing tenant leases and provide formal notice of the ownership change within 30 days. Walking out of the courthouse at 11:23 a.m., I felt like I was moving through a completely altered reality. The November sun seemed brighter, the air seemed clearer, and every step carried the weight of a decision that had fundamentally changed my relationship with Derek and proven my investment capabilities in the most dramatic way possible. I was no longer Emma, the ex-girlfriend who had been dismissed as financially naive. I was Emma, the property owner, Emma, the landlord, Emma, the person who would finally be impossible for Derek to ignore or patronize. But the euphoria of successful acquisition was immediately tempered by the enormity of the operational challenges that lay ahead. Owning the Meridian Apartments was only the first step in a complex process of building rehabilitation, tenant management, and financial optimization that would determine whether my investment was ultimately successful or whether I had simply purchased an expensive problem that would drain my resources and validate Derek's skepticism about my capabilities. The first obstacle emerged before I had even reached my car. My phone was buzzing with a call from Jennifer Walsh, my supervisor at Pacific Northwest Bank, who had apparently been notified about my auction participation by the legal department. Bank policies required employees to disclose any potential conflicts of interest related to foreclosed properties, and my purchase of a building that had been foreclosed by a competing institution created compliance issues that needed immediate attention. "Emma, congratulations on your acquisition," Jennifer said when I answered the call, her tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering potentially problematic news. "However, we need to discuss how this affects your position in our commercial lending department. There are regulatory concerns about conflicts of interest when bank employees acquire distressed properties. The compliance review process would require 3 weeks of documentation, legal analysis, and policy interpretation before I could receive final approval to maintain my current position while owning commercial real estate. During that period, I would be restricted from processing any loan applications related to Pearl District properties or multifamily buildings, which could significantly impact my work responsibilities and professional relationships. More immediately, I needed to arrange property inspections, contractor consultations, and insurance coverage for a building that had been poorly maintained and was experiencing multiple operational problems. The previous owners had deferred maintenance on critical systems, and my due diligence had identified structural issues that required immediate attention to prevent further deterioration and potential safety hazards. The HVAC system inspection revealed problems that were even more extensive than the foreclosure documents had indicated. The building's heating and cooling infrastructure was not only outdated, but had been improperly modified by previous owners who had prioritized short-term cost savings over long-term functionality. Replacing the entire system would cost approximately $85,000 and require temporary disruption to tenant comfort during the installation process. The electrical evaluation uncovered code violations that had been accumulating for years without proper remediation. The building's electrical panel was undersized for current tenant demands, several units had unsafe wiring modifications, and the common area lighting systems were creating both safety hazards and excessive energy costs. Bringing the electrical infrastructure up to current codes would require another $45,000 investment and coordination with city inspectors, who were notoriously thorough and demanding. But the most challenging obstacle was the human element of property management. The Meridian Apartments' existing tenants had been dealing with poor building management for months, and their relationship with any property owner was understandably strained. Several residents had been withholding portions of their rent due to maintenance issues that hadn't been addressed. Others had filed complaints with the city about habitability concerns, and the overall building atmosphere was tense and confrontational. My first tenant meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday morning in the building's small community room. 8 of the 12 units were currently occupied, and I had invited all existing residents to discuss the ownership transition, renovation plans, and their concerns about building operations. The meeting would be my first opportunity to establish credibility with tenants, while gathering information about problems that weren't apparent from financial documents and inspection reports. Derek would be at that meeting, though he didn't yet know that his ex-girlfriend was the new owner. The tenant notification letters I had sent earlier in the week were signed by Morrison Property Group, the management company I had retained to handle day-to-day operations. Derek and the other residents knew that the building had been sold and that changes were coming, but they had no idea who was behind the acquisition or what those changes might involve. The anticipation of Derek's reaction was almost overwhelming. For months, he had lectured me about my lack of real estate expertise and predicted that I would never succeed in property investment. Now I was about to reveal that I had purchased his building using exactly the analytical approach he had dismissed as impractical. The reversal was so complete and unexpected that I could barely imagine how he would process the information. But beyond the personal satisfaction, I was acutely aware that the next 6 months would determine whether I had made a brilliant investment or an expensive mistake. The building's financial performance would depend on my ability to retain existing tenants while attracting new residents, complete necessary renovations without exceeding my budget, and establish professional management systems that would generate positive cash flow. Derek's skepticism about my capabilities would prove either prescient or embarrassingly wrong based on how successfully I could execute the operational challenges that separated property ownership from property investment. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the obstacles couldn't have been more complex. But sitting in my car outside the courthouse that November morning, holding the temporary deed that made me Derek's landlord, I felt more confident about my abilities than I had at any point during our relationship. The execution phase was just beginning, and I was ready to prove that careful analysis and professional management could succeed where emotional decision-making and amateur operations had failed. The tenant meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. on Saturday morning in the Meridian Apartments community room, a cramped space on the ground floor that had been converted from a storage area by the previous owners. I arrived 30 minutes early to set up folding chairs and review my notes one final time, my heart pounding with anticipation about Derek's reaction when he discovered that his ex-girlfriend had become his new landlord. I had chosen to reveal my identity during the meeting rather than through individual conversations because I wanted all the tenants to witness Derek's response. The group dynamic would make it impossible for him to dismiss or minimize my accomplishment, and the professional context would force him to process the information publicly rather than privately, where he could rationalize it away or blame external factors for my success. Morrison Property Group had agreed to introduce me as the new owner without providing advance details about my background or qualifications. The management company's representative, Linda Morrison, was a seasoned professional who had repositioned dozens of underperforming properties throughout Portland. She understood the delicate balance required to establish authority with existing tenants while maintaining their cooperation during the transition period. "Good morning, everyone," Linda began as the last residents filtered into the community room. "Thank you for taking time to attend this meeting about the ownership transition and upcoming building improvements. Before we discuss specific renovation plans, I'd like to introduce you to the new owner of the Meridian Apartments." Derek was sitting in the second row, wearing a casual sweater and jeans that projected weekend relaxation rather than business formality. He had been checking his phone periodically since arriving, clearly more interested in his personal activities than building management discussions. Several other tenants looked equally disengaged, having apparently endured multiple meetings with previous owners who had made promises about improvements that never materialized. "Please welcome Emma Rodriguez," Linda announced, gesturing toward me as I stood up from my seat in the back of the room. The moment Derek looked up and saw me walking toward the front of the community room was absolutely priceless. His expression shifted through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching panic as he processed the implications of what Linda had just announced. I watched his face drain of color as he realized that his ex-girlfriend, the woman he had dismissed as financially naive and incapable of real estate investment, was now his landlord. "Hello, everyone," I said, projecting calm confidence despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I'm excited to discuss our plans for improving the Meridian Apartments and creating a better living experience for all residents." Derek's hand slowly lowered his phone to his lap as he stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and dawning recognition that everything he had believed about my capabilities had been completely wrong. The other tenants seemed confused by his reaction, but were focused on what I was saying about building improvements and maintenance schedules. "Over the next 6 months, we'll be systematically addressing the infrastructure issues that have been affecting your comfort and satisfaction," I continued, consulting my notes while maintaining eye contact with Derek. "This includes complete HVAC system replacement, electrical upgrades throughout the building, and comprehensive exterior maintenance that will improve both functionality and appearance." Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived in Unit 3B, raised her hand with a question about heating problems that had been ongoing for months. As I explained our renovation timeline and temporary accommodation plans for displaced residents, I could see Derek struggling to process the situation. He kept looking around the room as if expecting someone to reveal that this was an elaborate joke or misunderstanding. "The previous management company failed to maintain professional standards," I said, addressing tenant concerns about communication and responsiveness. "Morrison Property Group has been retained to ensure that all maintenance requests receive prompt attention and that building operations meet the highest professional standards going forward." A younger tenant asked about rent increases during the renovation period, which gave me an opportunity to demonstrate the business acumen that Derek had always insisted I lacked. "Rent adjustments will be implemented gradually and will reflect the improved value that residents receive from building upgrades," I explained. Our goal is to create a premium living experience that justifies market rate pricing while maintaining affordability for existing residents who choose to stay. Derek's neighbor, a software engineer named Mike who lived in Unit 2A, expressed skepticism about promises of improvement given the previous owner's track record. "We've heard this kind of talk before," he said bluntly. "How do we know this won't be another situation where cosmetic changes get made while fundamental problems continue?" "That's an excellent question," I replied, appreciating the opportunity to showcase my analytical approach. "Unlike previous ownership, our renovation plan is based on comprehensive building assessments and realistic financial projections. We're addressing infrastructure problems first, followed by aesthetic improvements that enhance the building's long-term value rather than just its short-term appearance." I distributed copies of the renovation timeline and contractor information, demonstrating the kind of detailed planning and professional coordination that successful property management required. The tenants seemed impressed by the thoroughness of the documentation and the specificity of the improvement schedules, but Derek appeared increasingly agitated as he realized the scope of what I had accomplished. "Are there any other questions about the renovation plans or timeline?" I asked, scanning the room for additional concerns. Derek finally found his voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. "Emma, can we talk privately after the meeting?" "Of course," I replied smoothly. "I'll be available to discuss individual concerns with any residents who have specific questions about their lease agreements or the transition process." The meeting concluded 20 minutes later with generally positive responses from tenants who seemed cautiously optimistic about the building's future under professional management. Several residents approached me afterward to express appreciation for the detailed planning and clear communication, which contrasted sharply with their previous experiences with absentee ownership and reactive maintenance policies. Derek waited until the other tenants had left before approaching me, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and frustration that I found deeply satisfying after months of condescending lectures about my financial limitations. "Emma, what the hell is going on?" he said once we were alone in the community room. "How did you buy this building? How is this even possible?" "It's possible because I understand real estate investment better than you realized," I replied calmly. "The building was foreclosed by Columbia River Trust. I identified it as an undervalued opportunity, and I successfully acquired it through the auction process." Derek's face shifted from confusion to something approaching anger as the implications sank in. "You bought my building? You actually bought the building where I live just to, prove some kind of point?" "I bought an investment property that offers excellent potential for appreciation and cash flow generation," I corrected. "The fact that you happen to live here is simply a coincidence that makes the acquisition more personally satisfying." "This is insane," Derek muttered, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustrated disbelief. "How did you even have the money for something like this? How did you get financing? This building must have cost over $1 million. $1.7 million, actually," I said, enjoying the way his eyes widened. "And I was able to finance it because I have excellent credit, stable income, and substantial savings that I accumulated through the kind of disciplined financial management you always criticized as overly conservative." Derek stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "But you work at a bank, you live in that tiny apartment, you clip coupons and buy generic groceries. How could you possibly have saved enough money for a down payment on $1 million property?" "That tiny apartment and those generic groceries are exactly how I saved enough money," I explained patiently. "While you were spending your inheritance on expensive cars and trendy restaurants, I was building capital and learning about commercial real estate through my work. It turns out that living below your means and understanding market fundamentals is more effective than projecting wealth you don't actually possess." The reference to his financial situation hit home, and Derek's expression shifted to defensive anger. "So this is what? Revenge? You bought my building to get back at me for breaking up with you?" "This is business," I replied firmly. "I identified an excellent investment opportunity, conducted thorough due diligence, and executed a successful acquisition. The fact that it proves how wrong you were about my capabilities is just a bonus." Derek began pacing around the small community room, clearly struggling to reconcile his assumptions about my financial limitations with the reality of my building ownership. "This doesn't make sense," he kept repeating. "You don't know anything about property management. You've never owned real estate before. How are you going to handle tenant issues and maintenance problems and all the operational stuff that actual landlords deal with?" The same way successful property owners handle those responsibilities, I said. Through professional management companies, qualified contractors, and systematic approaches to building operations. You know, the kind of analytical planning you always dismissed as theoretical rather than practical. But what about cash flow? What about vacancy rates and maintenance costs and all the financial challenges that make or break real estate investments? Derek's voice was rising now, his frustration becoming more apparent. You can't just buy a building and expect it to run itself profitably. You're absolutely right, I agreed. Which is why I spent 6 weeks developing comprehensive financial projections, contractor relationships, and management systems before making the acquisition. I also retained Morrison Property Group, which has a proven track record of successfully repositioning underperforming properties exactly like this one. Derek stopped pacing and stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. 6 weeks? You've been planning this for 6 weeks? I've been researching real estate investment opportunities since our relationship ended, I clarified. This specific building came to my attention through my work at the bank, and I realized it represented exactly the kind of value creation opportunity that careful analysis could identify and execute successfully. Your work at the bank, Derek repeated slowly, clearly beginning to understand how much he had underestimated my professional expertise and access to market information. You saw this building through a foreclosure proceeding. Among other sources, I confirmed. Commercial lending gives me insights into property values, market trends, and investment opportunities that most people never see. It's one of the advantages of working in the financial sector rather than just reading investment blogs and attending networking events. The comment was deliberately pointed, and Derek recognized it as a reference to his own approach to real estate education. His face flushed with embarrassment and anger, as he realized that I had been quietly building expertise while he had been lecturing me about my limitations. So what happens now? He asked finally, his voice subdued. Are you going to evict me? Raise my rent to punish me for not believing in your investment abilities? I'm going to manage this property professionally and profitably, I replied. Rent adjustments will be based on market rates and building improvements, not personal relationships. If you're a good tenant who pays on time and follows lease agreements, you're welcome to stay. If you become problematic, you'll be asked to leave like any other tenant who doesn't meet their obligations. Derek sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs, finally seeming to grasp the complete reversal of our power dynamic. I can't believe this is happening, he said quietly. 6 months ago, you were asking me for investment advice. Now you're my landlord. 6 months ago, you were explaining why I would never succeed in real estate, I corrected. Now you get to see exactly how wrong you were about my capabilities. The silence that followed was heavy, with unspoken recognition that our relationship had been permanently redefined. Derek was no longer the experienced investor, offering guidance to his financially naive ex-girlfriend. He was now the tenant whose housing security depended on his former partner's business decisions and professional judgment. Emma, he said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been respected. I owe you an apology. I completely underestimated what you were capable of accomplishing. Yes, you did, I agreed simply. But now you have the opportunity to witness firsthand what professional property management looks like when it's executed by someone who actually understands the business. Derek nodded slowly, clearly still processing the magnitude of what had just been revealed. I guess I'll be paying rent to my ex-girlfriend. You'll be paying rent to Rodriguez Property Holdings, I corrected with a slight smile. But yes, that rent will ultimately benefit your ex-girlfriend, who turned out to be much better at real estate investment than you ever imagined. 8 months after becoming Derek's landlord, the transformation of both the Meridian Apartments and my own life had exceeded every projection I had made during those intense weeks of planning. What I hadn't anticipated was how profoundly the experience would change not just my financial situation, but my entire relationship with risk, success, and the kind of person I wanted to become. The building renovations had been completed on schedule and under budget, a feat that impressed even Linda Morrison, who had warned me that first-time property owners typically underestimated both the complexity and cost of major improvements. The new HVAC system was operating flawlessly, the electrical upgrades had eliminated all safety concerns, and the exterior improvements had transformed the building from a maintenance liability into one of the most attractive properties in the Pearl District. More importantly, the financial performance had validated every aspect of my original business plan. All 12 units were now occupied, with a waiting list of prospective tenants that allowed me to be selective about lease approvals. The average rent had increased by 38% compared to the previous ownership, but tenant satisfaction surveys showed the highest ratings in the building's history. Professional management, responsive maintenance, and systematic improvements had created exactly the kind of premium living experience that justified market-rate pricing. The commercial space on the ground floor had been divided into 2 smaller units, as I had planned during my initial analysis. One space was now occupied by a boutique coffee roastery that had become a neighborhood gathering place, while the other housed a small architecture firm that appreciated the building's combination of historic character and modern functionality. Both tenants had signed 3-year leases at rates that significantly exceeded my original projections for commercial rental income. But the most satisfying aspect of the building's success was watching Derek's gradual recognition that everything he had believed about real estate investment had been systematically disproven by my approach. His rent had increased from $1,650 to $2,200 per month, reflecting both building improvements and market rate adjustments. But he had chosen to stay rather than search for alternative housing in an increasingly expensive rental market. Derek's behavior during the renovation period had been a masterclass in grudging respect mixed with wounded pride. He had initially been skeptical about the construction timeline and had questioned whether the improvements would justify the inevitable rent increases. When the HVAC installation began, he had complained about temporary inconvenience and predicted that the project would drag on for months beyond the scheduled completion date. But as each phase of the renovation was completed on time and to professional standards, Derek's skepticism had gradually given way to something approaching admiration for the project management and contractor coordination. The electrical upgrades had been completed during a single weekend with minimal disruption to residents. The exterior improvements had been finished 2 days ahead of schedule and had immediately improved the building's curb appeal and neighborhood perception. I have to admit, Derek had told me during one of our monthly property management meetings, this is not how I expected things to go. The contractors you hired actually show up when they say they will, and the work gets done right the first time. Those monthly meetings had become an unexpected source of insight into how Derek processed his changed circumstances. Initially, he had treated our interactions with formal distance, clearly uncomfortable with the power dynamic reversal, but determined to maintain his dignity as a tenant. Over time, his tone had shifted from defensive to curious as he began asking questions about property management strategies and renovation decision-making processes. "How did you know which contractors to hire?" he had asked during our March meeting. "I've been trying to find reliable people for small projects in my unit, but everyone I contact either doesn't show up or does substandard work. Professional property management companies maintain relationships with qualified contractors who depend on repeat business," I had explained. "Morrison Property Group has worked with the same electrical contractor for 8 years because they consistently deliver quality work on schedule. Individual homeowners typically hire based on the lowest bid rather than established performance records." Derek's questions revealed how much he still didn't understand about the operational side of real estate investment. Despite his confident discussions about market trends and investment strategies, he had never learned the practical skills required to maintain properties effectively or manage contractor relationships professionally. His approach to property ownership was theoretical rather than operational, which explained why his duplex continued to generate negative cash flow despite his optimistic projections. The contrast between Derek's amateur landlord approach and my systematic property management became more apparent when he started asking for advice about his own investment property. The duplex he had purchased with his inheritance was experiencing ongoing maintenance problems, tenant turnover issues, and rental income that barely covered his mortgage payments. By April, he was openly questioning whether he should sell the property rather than continue subsidizing what had become an expensive liability. "The problem is that I bought emotionally rather than analytically," Derek admitted during one conversation that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. "I saw a property in a neighborhood I liked, assumed the rental income would be higher than it actually is, and didn't budget adequately for maintenance and vacancy periods." "That's exactly the kind of investment approach you used to advocate," I reminded him gently. "Trusting market instincts rather than analyzing actual numbers." Yeah, well, it turns out that market instincts are pretty unreliable when they're not backed up by real data, Derek replied with a self-deprecating laugh. I spent so much time reading about real estate investment strategies that I convinced myself I understood the business better than I actually did. This admission represented a fundamental shift in Derek's self-perception and his understanding of what real estate expertise actually required. He was finally recognizing that successful property investment demanded operational skills, market knowledge, and financial discipline rather than confidence and enthusiasm alone. But Derek's transformation was only part of the broader changes that property ownership had created in my life. The success of the Meridian Apartments had established my credibility as a real estate investor and opened opportunities that I had never anticipated during my careful planning phase. Pacific Northwest Bank had not only approved my continued employment despite the potential conflicts of interest, but had actually promoted me to Assistant Vice President of Commercial Lending, based on my demonstrated understanding of property investment and market analysis. My colleagues now sought my input on commercial real estate deals, and several bank clients had requested that I personally handle their loan applications because of my reputation for thoroughness and market knowledge. More significantly, the building's financial performance had generated sufficient cash flow and equity appreciation to support additional property acquisitions. I had identified two more potential investments: a small office building in southeast Portland and a mixed-use property in the Hawthorne district that could be purchased using the Meridian Apartments as collateral for expanded borrowing capacity. The opportunity to build a real estate portfolio, rather than simply owning a single property, represented exactly the kind of wealth-building strategy that Derek had always claimed required years of experience and substantial capital. I was accomplishing it 18 months after our breakup, using the analytical approach he had dismissed as too conservative and theoretical. But perhaps the most unexpected aspect of my transformation was the confidence that successful property ownership had given me in other areas of my life. Making decisive business decisions under pressure, managing complex renovation projects, and handling tenant relationships had developed leadership skills that extended far beyond real estate investment. I had started dating again, something that had seemed impossible during the months when I was focused entirely on proving Derek wrong and executing my property acquisition strategy. Michael Chen, a software architect who lived in the Alberta Arts District, appreciated my business acumen and financial independence in ways that Derek never had. Our conversations about career goals and long-term planning felt like genuine partnerships rather than lectures about my limitations. "You're the most financially sophisticated woman I've ever dated," Michael had told me during one of our early dinners together. "Most people our age are still figuring out basic budgeting, but you're building actual wealth through strategic investments." The contrast with Derek's condescending attitude toward my financial goals was striking. Michael asked thoughtful questions about my property management strategies and seemed genuinely interested in learning from my experience, rather than explaining why my approach was flawed or unrealistic. Even more satisfying was the recognition I had begun receiving from Portland's real estate investment community. The Portland Real Estate Investors Association had invited me to speak at their monthly meeting about repositioning underperforming properties, and several experienced investors had approached me about potential partnerships on larger acquisitions. "Emma has demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical approach that separates successful investors from speculators," Harold Brennan had said when introducing me to the investor group. This was the same Harold Brennan who had bid against me at the foreclosure auction, and his endorsement carried significant weight among local real estate professionals. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek, who had spent months attending these same meetings and trying to establish credibility with experienced investors, was now known primarily as the tenant whose ex-girlfriend had become his landlord. His reputation in the investment community had shifted from aspiring professional to cautionary tale about the importance of understanding market fundamentals rather than just projecting confidence. But the most profound transformation was in how I thought about money, success, and the kind of life I wanted to build. Before buying the Meridian Apartments, I had been focused primarily on proving Derek wrong and demonstrating my investment capabilities. The financial returns and professional recognition were certainly satisfying, but they were secondary to the emotional validation of forcing Derek to acknowledge his mistakes. Now, with the building operating profitably and my reputation established, I was motivated by the intrinsic satisfaction of building wealth through strategic decision-making and operational excellence. Real estate investment had become less about proving anything to anyone else and more about creating financial security and professional fulfillment through systematic application of knowledge and discipline. The long-term vision was becoming clearer with each successful month of property management. Within 5 years, I could potentially own a portfolio of commercial properties throughout Portland that would generate sufficient passive income to make my banking career optional rather than necessary. Within 10 years, I might be in a position to develop properties rather than just acquiring and repositioning existing buildings. These goals felt achievable rather than fantastical because they were based on demonstrated performance rather than optimistic projections. The Meridian Apartments had proven that I could identify undervalued opportunities, execute complex acquisitions, and manage properties profitably. Scaling that success to additional properties was a matter of capital availability and deal selection rather than hoping that my investment theories would work in practice. Derek's final acknowledgement of how completely he had misjudged my capabilities came during our last formal property management meeting in September. His lease was up for renewal, and he had decided to move to a different building rather than continue living in a property owned by his ex-girlfriend. "Emma, I need to say something before I move out," Derek began, his tone more serious than usual. "I was completely wrong about your investment potential, and I owe you more than just an apology. You've built something remarkable here, and you did it using exactly the approach I dismissed as too conservative." "I appreciate that," I replied, genuinely touched by his honesty. "More than that," Derek continued, "you've shown me how much I didn't understand about real estate investment. I spent so much time reading about strategies and attending networking events that I convinced myself I was an expert. But I never developed the operational skills or analytical discipline that actually make investments successful." Derek's admission was both an apology and a recognition that our relationship had been built on fundamentally false assumptions about our respective capabilities and potential. He had positioned himself as the mentor who would guide my financial education, when in reality I had possessed superior knowledge and discipline that he had been unable to recognize or appreciate. "I hope you understand that buying this building wasn't about revenge," I said. "It was about proving to myself that I could succeed using my own methods and judgment." "I know that now," Derek replied. "And honestly, watching you manage this property has taught me more about real estate than all the books and seminars I consumed over the past few years. You've shown me what professional property management actually looks like." As Derek prepared to move out of the Meridian Apartments, I reflected on how completely our dynamic had been transformed. 18 months earlier, he had been the confident real estate investor explaining why I would never succeed in property ownership. Now he was the struggling amateur landlord seeking advice from his ex-girlfriend who had become one of Portland's most promising young real estate entrepreneurs. The building that Derek was leaving behind had become more than just a successful investment. It was proof that careful analysis, financial discipline, and operational excellence could create opportunities that emotional decision-making and projected confidence could never achieve. Every month of positive cash flow, every satisfied tenant, and every successful renovation project validated the analytical approach that Derek had dismissed as too theoretical for real-world application. But perhaps most importantly, the Meridian Apartments had given me something that no amount of professional success or financial returns could replicate: absolute confidence in my own judgment and capabilities. I no longer needed anyone else's validation or approval to pursue ambitious goals, because I had demonstrated that my methods worked when applied consistently and professionally. Derek had been wrong about my investment potential, but he had also been wrong about what success in real estate actually required. It wasn't about market instincts or aggressive risk-taking or networking with established investors. It was about understanding numbers, managing operations systematically, and making decisions based on data rather than emotions. Standing in the lobby of my building on the day Derek moved out, surrounded by satisfied tenants and successful renovations, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't proving Derek wrong. It was discovering exactly what I was capable of accomplishing when I stopped seeking permission and started taking action. The woman who had been dismissed as financially naive and overly conservative had become a property owner, a successful investor, and a recognized expert in her field. That transformation was worth more than any apology Derek could offer, because it represented something much more valuable than vindication. It represented the beginning of unlimited possibility. The ripple effects of my success with the Meridian Apartments extended far beyond Portland's real estate investment community. My story had caught the attention of regional business publications, and Portland Business Journal had featured me in their 30 Under 30 Inches spotlight for emerging entrepreneurs. The article, titled "From Bank Employee to Real Estate Mogul: How Analytical Thinking Beats Market Instincts," had generated interview requests from podcasts, real estate conferences, and even a cable television show about successful women in business. The media attention was flattering but also slightly overwhelming for someone who had spent years working quietly behind the scenes at Pacific Northwest Bank. Suddenly, I was being positioned as an expert on commercial real estate investment, market analysis, and property management strategies. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek, who had always craved recognition and credibility in the investment community, was watching his ex-girlfriend receive the kind of professional acclaim he had been pursuing unsuccessfully for years. The speaking engagements had become a significant source of additional income. The Portland Real Estate Investors Association paid me $2,500 for my presentation on identifying undervalued commercial properties through financial analysis. The Oregon Association of Realtors had booked me for their annual conference keynote at $5,000, and several out-of-state investor groups were offering similar fees for presentations about systematic property repositioning. These speaking fees represented more than just extra income. They were validation that my approach to real estate investment had broader applications beyond my specific success with the Meridian Apartments. Other investors wanted to learn the analytical methods I had developed through my banking career, and they were willing to pay substantial amounts for access to that knowledge. But the most significant opportunity had come from an unexpected source. Rebecca Martinez, a successful real estate developer based in Seattle, had contacted me about a potential partnership on a major mixed-use development project in Portland's Central Eastside Industrial District. Martinez Development had acquired a 2.3-acre site that was zoned for residential and commercial construction, but they needed a local partner with expertise in Portland's regulatory environment and financing landscape. "Emma, your reputation for analytical thoroughness and successful project execution is exactly what we need for this venture," Rebecca had explained during our initial phone conversation. "This project will involve coordinating with multiple city departments, managing complex financing structures, and overseeing construction timelines that could stretch over 18 months. We need someone who understands both the financial and operational sides of real estate development." The proposed partnership would involve a $12 million mixed-use development featuring 60 apartment units, ground-floor retail space, and structured parking. My role would include securing local financing, managing regulatory approvals, and overseeing construction management once the project broke ground. In exchange for these responsibilities, I would receive a 25% ownership stake in the completed development, along with management fees during the construction phase. The scale of the opportunity was breathtaking. 18 months after buying my first property, I was being invited to participate in a development project that would establish me as a major player in Portland's commercial real estate market. The financial returns could potentially exceed everything I had earned from the Meridian Apartments, while the professional credibility would position me for even larger opportunities in the future. Derek's reaction to news of the development partnership had been a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been pride. "Emma, that's incredible," he had said when I mentioned the project during one of our final conversations. $12 million? That's the kind of deal that established developers spend years trying to put together. It's also the kind of opportunity that becomes available when you build a reputation for delivering results, rather than just talking about investment strategies, I had replied, unable to resist a gentle reminder of how our approaches to real estate had differed. The development project had also attracted the attention of Pacific Northwest Bank's senior management, who were eager to finance the construction loan and potentially establish a broader relationship with Martinez Development. My supervisor, Jennifer Walsh, had approached me about transitioning from commercial lending into the bank's real estate development division, where I would focus exclusively on large-scale project financing and developer relationships. "Emma, you've demonstrated exactly the kind of market knowledge and client relationship skills that our development banking group needs," Jennifer had explained during our meeting about the potential career transition. "Your success with your own property investment gives you credibility with developer clients that traditional bankers often lack." The position would involve a substantial salary increase, from $71,000 to $95,000 annually, plus bonus opportunities based on the loan volume 1 generated for the development banking division. More importantly, it would provide insider access to major development projects throughout the Pacific Northwest, creating networking opportunities and market knowledge that could support my own investment activities. The career advancement represented a complete reversal from the financial limitations that Derek had always assumed would constrain my real estate ambitions. Instead of needing to choose between my banking career and property investment, I was discovering that success in one area was creating opportunities in the other. My real estate expertise was making me more valuable as a banker, while my banking relationships were providing access to investment opportunities that independent investors rarely encountered. The personal relationships in my life had been equally transformed by the confidence and financial security that property ownership had provided. My relationship with Michael Chen had progressed from casual dating to serious discussions about long-term goals and potential marriage. Unlike Derek, who had always positioned himself as the financial mentor in our relationship, Michael approached our partnership as equals who could support each other's professional ambitions. "I love that you're building something significant," Michael had told me during a recent dinner conversation about our future plans. "You're not just earning money, you're creating assets that will provide security and opportunities for decades. That's the kind of foundation that strong relationships are built on." Michael's software architecture firm was experiencing rapid growth, and he had been exploring opportunities to purchase office space rather than continue renting. Our combined financial resources and real estate expertise could potentially support a joint investment in commercial office property that would benefit both of our businesses while building shared wealth over time. The possibility of combining our resources for larger investment opportunities represented exactly the kind of financial partnership that I had hoped to develop with Derek. The difference was that Michael respected my expertise and wanted to learn from my experience, rather than dismissing my knowledge as theoretical or inadequate. My relationship with my family had also evolved significantly as news of my real estate success spread through our extended network. My parents, who had always worried about my financial security and modest lifestyle, were now bragging to their friends about their daughter, the real estate entrepreneur. My brothers, both of whom had followed conventional career paths, were asking for investment advice and expressing interest in potential real estate partnerships. "Emma always was the smartest one in the family," my father had told his colleagues at a recent school district event. "We knew she was good with numbers, but we didn't realize she was building a real estate empire while working at the bank." The family recognition was gratifying, but it also highlighted how much my self-perception had changed over the past year. I no longer needed external validation to feel confident about my capabilities or choices. The success of the Meridian Apartments had provided all the proof I needed that my analytical approach to decision-making was not only effective, but superior to the emotional, instinct-based strategies that people like Derek advocated. Financial security was perhaps the most profound change in my daily experience. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about emergency expenses or calculating the cost of every purchase. The rental income from the Meridian Apartments, combined with my increased salary and speaking fees, had created a level of financial flexibility that allowed me to focus on long-term wealth building rather than month-to-month budgeting. I had been able to upgrade from my modest studio apartment to a spacious two-bedroom unit in a newer building, complete with in-unit laundry and a balcony overlooking the Willamette River. The monthly rent was nearly double what I had been paying, but the improved living situation felt like a natural reflection of my changed circumstances rather than an extravagant indulgence. More importantly, I had established an investment account specifically for future real estate acquisitions, automatically transferring 20% of my monthly income into funds that would support additional property purchases. The systematic approach to capital accumulation reflected the same disciplined financial management that had made my initial success possible, but now it was focused on expansion, rather than just survival. The contrast with Derek's financial situation had become even more stark as his own investment struggles continued. His duplex was still generating negative cash flow, and he had been forced to supplement the rental income with his own money to cover mortgage payments and maintenance costs. The property that he had purchased as a wealth-building vehicle had instead become a financial drain that limited his ability to pursue other opportunities. "I'm seriously considering selling the duplex and getting out of real estate investment altogether," Derek had confessed during one of our conversations. "I thought I understood the business, but it turns out that owning rental property is much more complicated and expensive than I anticipated." Derek's potential exit from real estate investment represented the final validation of everything I had tried to explain to him about the importance of thorough analysis and realistic financial planning. His enthusiasm and confidence had been insufficient to overcome poor deal selection and inadequate operational management, exactly as I had predicted when he was pressuring me to invest in questionable properties. The transformation of our relationship, from romantic partners to landlord and tenant to professional acquaintances, had been surprisingly smooth, largely because Derek had eventually recognized the futility of challenging my expertise or questioning my methods. He had graciously accepted his new role as someone seeking advice rather than offering guidance, and our interactions had become genuinely helpful rather than condescending. "Emma, I know this might sound strange coming from your ex-boyfriend," Derek had said during our final conversation before his move out, "but I'm genuinely proud of what you've accomplished. You proved that success in real estate requires exactly the kind of skills that I didn't have and didn't appreciate in you." His admission was both an apology and a recognition that our relationship had failed partly because he had been unable to see my potential or value my contributions. The personal closure was satisfying, but it was less important than the professional confidence I had gained through proving my capabilities to myself. As I prepared for the next phase of my real estate career, involving larger projects and more complex partnerships, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by the decision to buy Derek's apartment building. What had started as a strategy for proving him wrong had evolved into a comprehensive restructuring of my professional identity, financial security, and personal relationships. The analytical approach that Derek had dismissed as overly conservative had generated returns that exceeded his most optimistic projections. The banking expertise he had considered irrelevant to real estate investment had provided competitive advantages that experienced investors envied. Most importantly, the financial discipline he had criticized as limiting had created opportunities for wealth building that his aggressive, instinct-based strategies had never achieved. The woman who had been told she would never own property had become a property owner, developer, and recognized expert whose advice was sought by investors throughout the region. That transformation represented more than professional success. It represented the complete vindication of an approach to life and business that prioritized careful analysis over emotional decision-making, long-term planning over short-term gratification, and systematic execution over confident improvisation. Standing in my new apartment, looking out at the Portland skyline, where my next development project would soon rise, I realized that Derek had given me an unexpected gift through his dismissive predictions about my future. He had provided the motivation to prove not just that he was wrong, but that I was capable of achieving success beyond anything either of us had imagined possible. The lessons learned from this entire experience had fundamentally reshaped my understanding of what success actually required, and how dramatically people could underestimate each other's potential. Derek's biggest mistake hadn't been his poor investment choices or his condescending attitude. It had been his complete inability to recognize talent and capability that didn't match his preconceived notions about what expertise looked like. This revelation had profound implications for how I approached new relationships, both personal and professional. I had learned to value substance over style, systematic thinking over confident presentation, and demonstrated results over projected potential. The flashy investor persona that Derek had cultivated was ultimately hollow because it wasn't supported by actual knowledge or operational competence. The contrast had become even more apparent as I built relationships within Portland's real estate community. The most successful investors I encountered were typically quiet, analytical people who focused on numbers rather than networking, on operational efficiency rather than social media presence. They evaluated opportunities based on cash flow projections and market fundamentals, not on gut feelings or exciting stories about neighborhood transformation. Marcus Webb, one of Derek's former investor friends who had initially dismissed my banking perspective during that disastrous dinner party, had approached me 6 months later seeking advice about a potential commercial acquisition. His previous investments, guided by the same instinct-based approach that Derek advocated, had performed poorly enough that he was questioning his entire investment strategy. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't hold past conversations against me," Marcus had said during our coffee meeting. "I've been following your success with the Meridian Apartments, And I'm starting to think that maybe the analytical approach I used to dismiss is actually what separates successful investors from people like me, who just get lucky occasionally. Marcus had gone on to explain that his real estate portfolio, which had looked impressive on paper, was actually generating negative returns when properly analyzed. High leverage, optimistic rental assumptions, and inadequate maintenance budgets had created a collection of properties that required constant capital injections rather than producing passive income. The problem is that I bought into the mythology that real estate investment was about vision and market timing, rather than boring operational management, Marcus had admitted. I wanted to be the guy who spotted trends before anyone else, but it turns out that consistent profitability comes from managing expenses and maintaining properties systematically. Our conversation had led to a consulting arrangement where I helped Marcus analyze his existing properties and develop realistic improvement plans. The work was interesting and well compensated, but more importantly, it demonstrated how many supposedly experienced investors were actually operating with fundamental knowledge gaps that careful analysis could identify and address. This consulting work had evolved into a formal side business called Rodriguez Real Estate Advisory, which provided investment analysis and property management guidance to individual investors and small investment groups. The client base included everyone from first-time buyers to established investors who had realized that their intuitive approaches weren't generating adequate returns. The advisory business was generating approximately $8,000 per month in additional income, which I was reinvesting into my own property acquisition fund. More significantly, the consulting work was providing insights into market opportunities and investor psychology that informed my own investment decisions. I was learning from other people's mistakes while getting paid for the education. One of the most valuable lessons from the consulting work was recognizing how often real estate investment failures stemmed from emotional rather than financial factors. Investors would fall in love with properties that didn't meet their stated investment criteria, or they would avoid excellent opportunities because the buildings weren't exciting or glamorous enough to generate social media content. Derek's approach to real estate had been fundamentally emotional, though he had disguised it as market analysis and strategic thinking. He wanted to own properties that made him feel successful and sophisticated, regardless of whether they actually generated profits. The duplex he had purchased was located in a trendy neighborhood that enhanced his self-image as a savvy investor, but the financial performance was secondary to the psychological satisfaction of owning real estate. My approach had always been the opposite. I was willing to own any property that generated adequate returns, regardless of whether it enhanced my personal brand or provided exciting conversation topics at dinner parties. The Meridian Apartments had been attractive partly because it was undervalued due to operational problems that scared away investors who prioritized easy management over profit potential. This difference in investment philosophy had broader implications for how we approached risk and opportunity in all areas of life. Derek had consistently chosen options that provided immediate gratification or social validation, while I had focused on long-term outcomes and systematic progress toward clearly defined goals. The pattern was evident in our career choices as well. Derek had selected project management because it provided variety and visible leadership opportunities. But he had never developed specialized expertise that would make him indispensable or highly compensated. I had chosen commercial lending because it provided access to market information and skill development that would support my real estate ambitions, even though the work was less glamorous than Derek's project management role. Our different approaches to money management had been equally revealing. Derek had spent his inheritance on lifestyle improvements and speculative investments that enhanced his immediate quality of life but didn't build long-term wealth. I had lived below my means and accumulated capital systematically, sacrificing short-term consumption for long-term financial security. The relationship dynamics we had developed reflected these fundamental differences in values and priorities. Derek had wanted a girlfriend who would admire his achievements and support his self-image as a successful entrepreneur. I had wanted a partner who would respect my goals and contribute to our mutual financial progress through complementary skills and shared commitment to building wealth. Our incompatibility had been inevitable, but Derek's condescending attitude toward my capabilities had made the breakup particularly painful and motivated. If he had simply acknowledged that we had different approaches to money and investing, I might have accepted the relationship's end without feeling compelled to prove my competence through dramatic action. Instead, his dismissive predictions about my future had created a challenge that I couldn't ignore. He had essentially declared that my analytical approach to decision-making was inferior to his intuitive strategies. and that I would never succeed in real estate because I lacked the personality traits and risk tolerance that he considered essential for investment success. Proving Derek wrong had required more than just buying property. It had required demonstrating that careful analysis could consistently outperform market instincts, that systematic planning could generate better results than emotional decision-making, and that operational competence was more valuable than networking ability or confident presentation. The success of the Meridian Apartments had validated all of these principles in ways that even Derek couldn't rationalize away. The building's transformation from a failing investment to a profitable asset had been accomplished through exactly the kind of methodical approach that he had dismissed as overly conservative and impractical. But the most satisfying aspect of my success was realizing that I no longer cared whether Derek acknowledged his mistakes or appreciated my accomplishments. The external validation that I had initially sought had become irrelevant once I had proven my capabilities to myself and established my reputation within the real estate community. The confidence gained from successful property ownership had extended into every aspect of my life. I was more assertive in professional settings, more selective about personal relationships, and more willing to pursue ambitious goals that might have seemed unrealistic when I was seeking approval from people who didn't understand my potential. This transformation had been particularly evident in my interactions with potential romantic partners. I was no longer willing to tolerate condescending attitudes or dismissive comments about my career ambitions. The financial security and professional recognition I had achieved made it clear that I deserved relationships with people who respected my accomplishments and supported my continued growth. Michael Chen's appreciation for my business acumen and financial independence had initially seemed almost too good to be true after years of Derek's subtle undermining of my confidence. But as our relationship developed, I realized that Michael's supportive attitude was simply what healthy partnerships looked like when both people respected each other's capabilities and contributions. I learned something new about real estate every time we talk, Michael had told me during a recent conversation about my development project. You've built expertise in an area that most people only understand superficially, and you've done it while maintaining your banking career and building a consulting business. That kind of systematic competence is incredibly attractive. The contrast with Derek's attitude was striking. Instead of feeling threatened by my knowledge, or trying to position himself as the expert in our relationship, Michael was genuinely interested in understanding my work and potentially collaborating on future investments. He asked thoughtful questions about market analysis and property management, and he treated my insights as valuable contributions, rather than theoretical observations that needed validation from people with real experience. Our discussions about potential joint investments had led to serious consideration of purchasing a small office building that could house both of our businesses while generating rental income from additional tenants. The financial projections were compelling, and the operational benefits of owning rather than renting office space aligned with both of our long-term business goals. More importantly, the potential partnership represented the kind of financial collaboration that I had hoped to develop with Derek. We would be combining our resources and expertise to pursue opportunities that neither of us could access independently, while maintaining separate professional identities and decision-making authority. The possibility of building wealth through strategic partnerships with people who respected my contributions felt like the natural evolution of everything I had learned about real estate investment and relationship dynamics. Success in both areas required finding people whose capabilities complemented your own, rather than trying to prove your worth to people who couldn't recognize your potential. Looking back on the entire experience, from Derek's dismissive predictions to my current position as a recognized real estate entrepreneur, I could see how each challenge had contributed to my personal and professional development. The pain of being underestimated had motivated me to exceed every expectation, while the satisfaction of proving skeptics wrong had built confidence that supported even more ambitious goals. The woman who had been told she would never own property had not only become a successful investor, but had used that success as a foundation for building influence, expertise, and financial security that extended far beyond real estate. The analytical skills that Derek had dismissed as limiting had actually been the key to unlocking opportunities that his instinct-based approach could never have identified or executed. But perhaps the most important lesson was recognizing that other people's opinions about your potential are ultimately irrelevant if you're willing to do the work required to prove them wrong. Derek's predictions about my future had been based on his limited understanding of what success required and his inability to recognize capabilities that didn't match his preconceived notions about expertise and competence. The real victory wasn't becoming Derek's landlord or demonstrating that his investment philosophy was flawed. It was discovering that I was capable of achieving success that exceeded both of our original expectations. That realization had transformed not just my financial situation but my entire relationship with possibility and ambition. Standing in my upgraded apartment, reviewing financial statements from multiple income streams, and planning for development projects that would establish me as a major player in Portland's real estate market, I understood that Derek had been right about one thing. Our breakup had been necessary for both of us to discover who we really were and what we were capable of accomplishing. The difference was that I had used the experience as motivation to build something meaningful, while Derek was still struggling with the same investment strategies that had failed him from the beginning. That divergence in outcomes reflected the fundamental difference in how we approached challenges and opportunities. I learned from mistakes and adjusted my strategies accordingly, while Derek preferred to blame external factors rather than examining whether his methods were actually effective. The future looked brighter than anything I had imagined possible during those difficult months after our relationship ended. The success of the Meridian Apartments had created a foundation for building lasting wealth and influence, while the lessons learned from proving Derek wrong had developed skills and confidence that would benefit every aspect of my life going forward. The psychological impact of this transformation couldn't be overstated. For years, I had unconsciously accepted limitations that others had placed on my potential, believing that my careful, analytical nature somehow disqualified me from the kind of bold success that people like Derek achieved through confidence and risk-taking. The realization that my approach was actually superior had been liberating in ways that extended far beyond real estate investment. This newfound confidence had influenced my decision-making in areas I hadn't anticipated. When Pacific Northwest Bank offered me the development banking position, I had negotiated aggressively for salary, bonus structure, and flexible work arrangements that would accommodate my growing real estate activities. The old Emma would have gratefully accepted whatever terms were offered, but the new Emma understood her value and wasn't afraid to advocate for compensation that reflected her contributions. The negotiation had resulted in a starting salary of $105,000, $10,000 higher than the original offer, plus performance bonuses that could add another $25,000 annually based on loan volume and client satisfaction metrics. More importantly, I had secured approval to work remotely 2 days per week, which would allow me to manage my properties and consulting business without compromising my banking responsibilities. Similar assertiveness had emerged in my consulting work with Rodriguez Real Estate Advisory. Instead of underpricing my services to attract clients, I had researched market rates for real estate consulting and positioned myself at the premium end of the range based on my track record and specialized knowledge. The strategy had worked. Clients were willing to pay $200 per hour for property analysis and investment guidance because they recognized the value of working with someone who had successfully executed the strategies they were hoping to learn. The consulting business had also opened doors to speaking opportunities that were far more lucrative than I had initially anticipated. A real estate investment seminar company based in San Francisco had booked me for a series of weekend workshops throughout California, Oregon, and Washington, offering $15,000 per weekend plus travel expenses. The workshops focused on analytical methods for real estate success and consistently sold out despite premium pricing that attracted serious investors rather than casual hobbyists. These speaking engagements had introduced me to a network of high-net-worth individuals who were seeking investment opportunities and professional management for their real estate portfolios. Several attendees had approached me about managing their Pacific Northwest properties, leading to additional income streams through property management fees and acquisition consulting for out-of-state investors. One particularly significant connection had come through the San Francisco seminar series. Dr. Patricia Liu, a successful surgeon who owned residential properties throughout California, was planning to expand into the Pacific Northwest market, but lacked local expertise for identifying and managing investments. She had proposed a partnership arrangement where I would source and manage Portland area properties, while she provided capital for larger acquisitions. Emma, your systematic approach to market analysis is exactly what I need for expanding outside my home market, Dr. Liu had explained during our initial phone conversation. I've been successful in California real estate, but I don't have the local knowledge or time availability to properly evaluate opportunities in Portland. Your combination of banking expertise and proven investment performance makes you an ideal partner for this expansion. The proposed partnership structure would involve Dr. Liu providing capital for property acquisitions, while I handled all aspects of deal sourcing, due diligence, and ongoing management. The profit-sharing arrangement would give me 30% ownership in each property plus management fees, creating potential for significant wealth building through other people's capital. This type of partnership represented exactly the kind of scalable business model that could generate substantial passive income while building long-term wealth. Instead of being limited by my own capital availability, I could leverage my expertise and local market knowledge to participate in larger deals funded by investors who valued professional management and analytical rigor. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek, who had always claimed that real estate success required substantial personal capital and risk tolerance, was watching me build wealth through knowledge and expertise, rather than borrowed money and emotional decision-making. My approach had proven more sustainable and scalable than his leverage speculation, because it was based on demonstrable skills that investors valued enough to pay for access to. The development project with Rebecca Martinez had progressed beyond the initial planning phases, with city approvals secured and construction financing arranged through Pacific Northwest Bank's Development Lending Division. My role in coordinating the regulatory process and managing local contractor relationships had impressed Rebecca enough that she was already discussing additional joint ventures for other Pacific Northwest markets. Emma, this Portland project is just the beginning of what we could accomplish together, Rebecca had said during our most recent project meeting. I have development opportunities identified in Seattle, Vancouver, and Boise that would benefit from the same analytical approach and local expertise that you've provided here. We could potentially scale this partnership into a regional development company. The prospect of becoming a principal in a regional development firm represented a level of professional achievement that would have been unimaginable during my relationship with Derek. The transition from overlooked bank employee to recognized real estate entrepreneur had happened faster than anyone could have predicted, driven by the systematic application of analytical skills that Derek had dismissed as irrelevant to investment success. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my transformation was the respect I had earned from other women in business, who were building wealth and influence in traditionally male-dominated industries. The Portland chapter of Women in Real Estate had invited me to join their board of directors, and I had been selected as a mentor for their emerging entrepreneur program. Working with younger women who were starting their real estate careers reminded me of my own struggles with confidence and external validation. Many of them had encountered dismissive attitudes from male colleagues or romantic partners who couldn't recognize their potential or value their contributions. My story provided evidence that systematic competence and persistent effort could overcome any initial disadvantages or skepticism. Emma, seeing your success gives me hope that I don't have to choose between being taken seriously and being successful, one mentee had told me during a recent meeting. You've shown that analytical thinking and careful planning can be more effective than aggressive networking and confident presentations. The mentoring work was personally fulfilling but also strategically valuable for building relationships with talented women who might become future business partners or clients. Several mentees had already contracted with Rodriguez Real Estate Advisory for investment guidance, while others were developing expertise that could support collaborative projects as their careers advanced. The network effects of success were becoming increasingly apparent as my reputation in Portland's business community continued to grow. Bank clients were referring real estate investment opportunities to me, consulting clients were introducing me to potential development partners, and speaking engagements were generating consulting inquiries from investors throughout the Pacific Northwest. This virtuous cycle of recognition and opportunity was exactly what Derek had been trying to create through his networking activities and social media presence, but he had been focused on projection rather than performance. His approach had been designed to create the appearance of success rather than the substance that would actually generate opportunities and income. My approach had been the opposite, focusing entirely on delivering results and building competence, with recognition and opportunities flowing naturally from demonstrated performance. The difference in outcomes validated everything I had believed about the superiority of substance over style, systematic execution over confident improvisation. The financial results of this approach were becoming increasingly impressive. Between my bank salary, consulting income, speaking fees, property management revenues, and rental income from the Meridian apartments, I was earning approximately $18,000 per month, more than triple my income from 2 years earlier. More importantly, the diversified income streams provided security and flexibility that a single job could never offer. The wealth building was accelerating as well. The equity appreciation in the Meridian apartments, combined with systematic savings from multiple income sources, had built a real estate investment fund that could support additional property acquisitions without requiring external financing. The financial independence that Derek had always claimed required decades of careful saving was becoming achievable within 5 years through strategic investment and business development. But beyond the financial success, the personal growth had been equally valuable. The confidence gained from proving my capabilities had eliminated the self-doubt and need for external validation that had characterized my earlier relationships and career decisions. I was now comfortable taking calculated risks and pursuing ambitious goals because I had evidence that careful planning and systematic execution could overcome most obstacles. This transformation had been particularly evident in my approach to the Martinez development project, where I had taken on responsibilities that would have seemed overwhelming just 2 years earlier. Coordinating with city planning departments, managing contractor relationships, and overseeing construction timelines required exactly the kind of operational competence that Derek had claimed I lacked. The project's success had validated my ability to handle complex, high-stakes business challenges while maintaining the analytical rigor that ensured successful outcomes. The combination of technical expertise and practical management skills had proven attractive to other developers who were seeking reliable partners for Pacific Northwest projects. 3 additional development groups had contacted me about potential partnerships, each offering variations of profit-sharing arrangements that would provide ownership stakes in exchange for local market expertise and project management capabilities. The opportunity to participate in multiple development projects simultaneously could potentially generate wealth that exceeded anything achievable through individual property investment. The strategic question was how to scale these opportunities without overextending my capabilities or compromising the quality standards that had built my reputation. The consulting business, property management activities, and development partnerships all required significant time commitments, while my banking career continued to provide both income and market access that supported my real estate activities. The solution was beginning to emerge through conversations with Michael Chen about formalizing our partnership and potentially establishing a real estate investment and development company that could systematically pursue larger opportunities. His software expertise and my real estate knowledge could create operational efficiencies that would allow us to manage multiple projects while maintaining the analytical standards that ensured profitable outcomes. Emma, we're both at points in our careers where we could either continue growing our individual businesses or combine our resources to pursue opportunities that neither of us could handle alone, Michael had said during a recent discussion about our future plans. Your real estate expertise and my technology background could create competitive advantages that would attract investment capital and development partnerships. The prospect of building a company with someone who genuinely respected my contributions and understood my methods was exciting in ways that went beyond financial projections. After years of having my capabilities questioned or dismissed, the opportunity to work with a partner who valued analytical rigor and systematic planning felt like the natural evolution of everything I had learned about business and relationships. The company structure we were discussing would leverage my real estate expertise and market relationships, while using Michael's software development skills to create technology solutions that would improve investment analysis and property management efficiency. The combination could potentially create a scalable business model that would attract institutional investors and provide access to development opportunities throughout the Pacific Northwest. Looking back on the journey from dismissed ex-girlfriend to recognized real estate entrepreneur, I could see how each challenge had contributed to building the skills and confidence that were now creating unlimited possibilities. Derek's condescending predictions about my future had provided exactly the motivation needed to exceed every expectation and prove that analytical thinking could consistently outperform emotional decision-making. But the most important realization was that success in real estate, like success in any field, ultimately came down to competence, persistence, and the willingness to learn from both mistakes and achievements. The flashy confidence and networking activities that Derek had prioritized were ultimately superficial, compared to the operational excellence and market knowledge that actually generated profits and built lasting wealth. The transformation from seeking validation to building genuine expertise had been the key to everything that followed. Once I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who couldn't recognize my potential and started focusing on developing skills that produced measurable results, the recognition and opportunities had followed naturally. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.